Hey everyone, I'm Eric Whiting, the writer and director of Ragmork. So I wanted to say thank you to the Sarah of Horror Festival for selecting the film. And in the background behind me is actually part of my workplace, Dayton Access Television. I featured some of the scenery in the movie during a scene towards the end. So I figured I'd do my interview here. So to answer the first question, how did your love for horror begin? Honestly, a lot of it began with box covers and books. So it was the early 90s when Silence of the Lambs came out on VHS. I was about 2 when the movie came out, but I was probably 3 by the time it came out on VHS, so I remember being fascinated by the box cover for that. And then shortly after, I remember also being fascinated by the box cover for Candyman. So between that and other box covers, Hellraiser comes to mind. That was my first introduction to horror, but I wasn't allowed to watch horror movies. So initially that, plus when I was 9, I read The Black Cat by Edgar Allan Poe. So that's another early introduction to horror. I also read Goosebumps when I was in 1st and 2nd grade and a little bit beyond that. So then by the time I was about 13 or 14 is when I started reading Stephen King and started watching more classic horror films. So what made you want to be a filmmaker? That started for me when I was pretty young, because I was real young when I watched Star Wars, Jurassic Park, and E.T. So a lot of those as a kid, I just remember being fascinated by how those were made. And I started to imagine my own stories. I started writing my own stories and we had a VHS camcorder in the mid-90s, so I would stand in front of the camcorder and act out stories I had in mind. Basically, yeah, from a pretty young age, I knew that was a thing I really wanted to do. So how did I come up with the story for Ragmork? Well, it actually began when I was 13. My younger brother, when he was at school, some kids made up a story about a guy named Shadow Man. They claimed he lurked around their schoolyard. So the movie Signs was very new at that time, so I ripped off the movie Signs and made it up about this guy called Shadow Man. And then I started to tell that story mostly to relatives, and then I actually wrote it as a short story. I was planning to make a movie of Shadow Man. So by 2016, which is when I started writing Ragmork, I was 27, so a lot of the more childish elements from Shadow Man didn't gel with me as much. And Shadow Man would have been kind of like Stranger Things mixed with, a dead guy, which could have been interesting. But anyway, yeah, Ragmork, I was more interested in adult existential dread and surreal horror. So that's where the story for Ragmork originated. What's been the most challenging and rewarding part of filmmaking? So my biggest challenge is I'm self-funded. I don't have a ton of money for filmmaking. So that's my biggest goal, or my biggest obstacle, I meant to say, is I'm at the mercy of who I can find to give up their weekends, who's able to show up and read lines. I don't have any talent agencies I work with. I have a little bit of gear, but it's mostly pretty limited. So limited resources are a bit of a hindrance. There's a lot of stuff I want to do that's very difficult to do for that reason, but it also forces you to be creative in other ways too. And I should mention that lack of resources is no excuse for lazy filmmaking. You can still be very creative and very, I don't know what the word I'm trying to think of. You can still be very creative with limited resources is what I'm trying to say. Now, the most rewarding part for me, because also the other end of the sword, because I'm working for myself, I don't have to answer to studio heads. So all the films I've made, they've been mostly my vision. I put some other people's criticisms and stuff, I keep some of that in mind if I agree with it, because, it's not good to be surrounded by yes men all the time. It's good to have people that question you and question your choices, and it's good for you as the creator to decide if everything you've done is good or not to your liking. But it's been rewarding to be able to make my own movies as I want them to be with the resources I have. Now, for the final one, which horror movies are your favorites? A lot of my favorites are a lot of the basic ones. I love Halloween, Evil Dead 1 and 2, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, The Shining, The Exorcist, Candyman. One that isn't mentioned quite as much but is awesome is Spore Loose, The Vanishing. If you ever watch that, make sure you watch the Dutch one and not the American one. Now this year there's been a lot of great horror movies that have come out in theaters, so that's been a nice kind of after the lockdown renaissance for horror. Recently I loved Pearl, and I also liked X. What else we got? Barbarian was awesome. And going back a few years, The Lighthouse was good. And there's been a lot of other great horror movies as well that have come out. But yeah, it's been a good year to go to the movies for horror this year. If you count Nope as horror, I loved Nope a lot. So otherwise, just wanted to say thanks again for selecting Ragmork for the festival, and enjoy the film.